Hi, I'm Jen Barnes, and you're about to experience how to ditch the old ways of doing things, embrace your neurodivergence, learn tips and tricks to function optimally, and love yourself, neurodivergence and all. Welcome to the Self Loved Woman podcast. Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. Today, we're going to dig into the negative, even destructive ways that hustle culture and the pushing and pushing can impact ADHD women entrepreneurs. And I got to say, I think most of us have felt the impact of this at one time or another. So if this is you, there's no shame in it. But I want to talk about it in case we still find ourselves in these cycles, because I'll notice sometimes it'll pop back up for me. And it's always good to have a reminder. But if you're someone who's never thought about this and you've just been pushing and pushing and pushing and then crashing and back to pushing and crashing and pushing and crashing, then this is a super important episode. It's important either way, right? But I was thinking a lot about this. I did a workshop for another entrepreneur's program on nervous system regulation and mastering your nervous system. And one of the questions that came up was it was an awesome question. It was a question that's on a lot of people's minds is like, what do you do when you have so much on your plate and you just have this huge deadline and you need to get it done and taking a break does not feel like an option, right? Taking a break to regulate your nervous system doesn't feel available. And the person was like, I think I know the answer. You're going to tell me to take the break, but I want to know and wanted to know why. And so I really want to dig into that and some of the deeper ways that this can impact ADHD women particularly because it does have a bigger impact us, and we'll talk about the impact on chronic stress that chronic stress has on dopamine in a little bit. But first I want to share like I don't know about all of you, but for most of my life I can say with pretty good certainty that the hustling, the pushing, and then crashing is really all I ever knew. I gotta believe I'm not alone. And some of you, a couple weeks ago, we talked about the overfunctioning, high achieving type of ADHD. In the past, we've talked about people who feel like underachievers with ADHD. And so, based on your experiences of your ADHD, it might be different for you. But maybe you find yourself in the pushing now, or maybe you're thinking, gosh, if only I could push myself like that. I'm here to share the dark side. But there's challenges to any approach. But for a lot of us, the way we learned how to function with our ADHD was to push and push. But that would result in crashing. And if you've been listening to me for a while, you might remember me talking about my mom being upset anytime I had a college break. Not because she wasn't excited to see me, she was super excited to see me, except that would have finals every time right before I came home on a break, right? And I would be pushing and pushing and pushing to get through my classes and exams, projects, homework, whatever. And then I would be on break and I would crash. And if you've done this at all, you know that crash means you often got sick. So my mom was like, you come home and you're always sick because you push yourself too hard. And she wasn't wrong. But my 20-year-old self wasn't ready to hear that. And nor was my I don't know that any of my 20 something selves were ready to hear that, right? Probably not that early in my life, but she wasn't wrong. That pushing and pushing and pushing can take a toll. But for a lot of us, this is this is how we learn to do it, not to mention when you're starting a business, oftentimes you're starting a business on the side of whatever else you've got going on. So you might have a full-time job, or in my case, full-time private practice. You might have, which is now more of a part-time private practice, but you might be full-time momming. Maybe you're homeschooling your kids. Maybe you're homeschooling your kids, full-time momming, and have a part-time job, right? And you're starting a business. And very rarely do I hear entrepreneurs be like, yeah, I don't really have anything going on in my life. I just kind of sit around most of the time. So I figured it'd be a good idea to start a business. I have yet to hear that. And I don't think that's because I work with ADHD women entrepreneurs. I think that's probably pretty true across the board that most entrepreneurs are doing this alongside of something else. And why is that important? Well, here's what it means. It means that your plate just got fuller by a lot. And it means that pace that you started at when you were building your business on the side of whatever else is in your life is not a sustainable pace. That's not, hopefully, not going to be the pace that you're going to live at for the rest of your life. The whole purpose of building a business, usually for most people, is time and money freedom over and above helping people, of course. Like you want to help people for sure. But let's be honest, if you're in business, you also want to make money to support yourself and maybe others, depending on what your situation is. But a big part of that can also be wanting freedom. Freedom to make your own schedule, freedom to work your own way, freedom to have money and decide how much you're paid. I mean, within reason, right? Like, probably couldn't charge $10,000 for an hour of coaching. I don't know. Maybe you could if you're, I don't know, who's the guy? Tony Robbins, maybe. Maybe you're Tony Robbins. Maybe he charges more than $10,000 for an hour of coaching. But my point is, before I go off the rails here with my ADHD, is that a lot of us, we are in a state of pushing and pushing while we are building our business alongside of something else. And then when that something else doesn't need to be our focus anymore because our business is growing, we can end up creating that same dynamic in our business because we forget that, like, oh, okay, now I don't need to push that hard because I'm not in the beginning building phase. That doesn't mean you're not going to work in your business. It doesn't mean you're not going to work on your business. It doesn't mean you're going to stop doing things, serving your clients or whatever. But you may find that you don't need to push quite so hard once you're there. But a lot of people keep doing it out of habit. I remember when I started it would have been my second private practice. My first one was in 2006. And we'll just call that a good lesson in learning. Like, wow, I learned a lot from that experience. But my second one, I had forgotten how much for a while there, you're kind of doing two full-time gigs. And it was particularly true for me because during that transition, I was in a contract as a military family life counselor, so an MFLAC, which is a 6-month contract, and you have to finish your contract. But about 4 months into that final 6-month contract, I was ready to go full time in my private practice. I was full time in my private practice. So it was, oh crap, here we go. I guess I'm going to do both of these full time. And that took some time for me to recover from, to get out of that habit of constantly working. When I say some time, a couple of years, some of it was because I didn't know I was doing it, but some of it is truly to get regulated again and slow down the pace and recognize that I was my own boss and I didn't have someone there who was going to yell at me if it wasn't done their way. And that I could actually make my own policies as long as they were compliant with ethics and what insurance companies required, because I bill insurance companies for that service. And so I remember what that was like with that. And building this business, I know what that's like too. But the problem is when we stay in that, when we push and push, when we hustle, we are actually going to be less productive. And I want to break down why. You're going to be less productive, less able to do the things you need to do. And this is why. When you're pushing and pushing, you are in your fight or flight response chronically. You're chronically in your fight or flight response, which is a stress response, right? Your body has perceived a threat. In this case, getting through your workday in both whatever you're building and whatever is your side thing. Or maybe you're just used to pushing, pushing, and pushing like I was when I was young from ADHD, or I should say younger, because did that well through my 20s. But you get used to that, and that's just what you know. But that doesn't mean your nervous system sees that as safe. your nervous system is over there being like, hello. And that's why I know I was diagnosed with anxiety in my 20s, which I now see was really secondary to the ADHD and the way I was trying to cope with it. But really, a lot of times when we're chronically in our fight or flight response, that can show up in anxiety, irritability, which none of that's great for attracting clients. None of that's great for being in alignment with your highest self, which is where you want your content to come from, where you want your offers to come from. The strongest businesses are the ones that come from our deepest wisdom. And so when we are chronically in our fight or flight response, it's really almost impossible to access that because your body is determined to help you survive. In fact, when you are or at all in your fight or flight response, your body deprioritizes everything except survival. That means the activity in your prefrontal cortex, which sounds like a big fancy name, but all of it is the front part of your brain, the CEO of your brain, the part where executive function happens, the thinking and planning part of your brain, the focusing part of your brain, the language and hearing parts of your brain are up in there. And so a lot of things are very negatively impacted by chronically being in your fight or flight response, even temporarily, right? If you're having a stressful day and you're in your fight or flight response, you're going to have a hell of a time being able to write content or focus on anything of depth. Even if something stressful happens on the way into work, if you don't clear that energy, it's very, very hard if you're still in your fight or flight response to focus on whatever it is that you need to focus on. It's going to be hard to feel motivated to do anything that other than protective type things that come from the fight or flight response. You'll be more irritable and anxious, like I said. And this is a tough one. Follow through is going to be harder for sure. But another tough one that we don't see as tough till it gets really tough is the rest of your systems are not going to function optimally. What does that mean? That means things that are not primary in helping you get to safety, helping you survive, are deprioritized too. So that means digestive system, immune system, reproductive system. So when you're in your fight or flight response, even just if it's a quick blip and then you're back to regulated into that state, that ventral vagal state where you feel safe enough to rest, digest, and connect, the social engagement system, even if it's only temporary, your digestion, reproductive system, and immune system are not really doing much when you are in your fight or flight response. That's because your body wants you to survive. If you have a tiger chasing you, it doesn't matter. Your body's everything else but getting away is irrelevant. It doesn't want to put energy into digesting a meal or fighting off a flu bug or getting pregnant or easing the symptoms of perimenopause if you are running from a tiger because all your energy needs to go to getting away, getting to safety, to surviving. And that's why a lot of times when we are chronically stressed, i.e., chronically pushing, hustling, we end up with digestive issues. You end up constipated or having diarrhea. You can end up sick with like colds that don't seem to go away or worse. You can struggle with, for sure, if you're trying to get pregnant or stay pregnant. One of the things, and this is obviously not always the issue there. I want to be clear. We're in no way blaming people who are struggling to get pregnant or keep a pregnancy, right? It's not always this. But one of the things that I've observed throughout my life is women trying to get pregnant. And there's someone in my own family, right? And all this pressure. And then once they adopt, all of a sudden it's no problem. Like it would be no problem, right? And it's like, okay, yeah, because now the pressure's off. That's why you'll see a lot of people, not a lot of people, but people out in the world who have adopted kids also have a bio kid that's about the same age as the kid they adopted. And it's because once the pressure was off to get pregnant, their nervous system was no longer chronically stressed. And so their reproductive system went back online. And now that's not always the case. Like I said, sometimes there's legitimately other things going on. So just to be clear, it isn't always that. But we know that your secondary systems are not going to function optimally when you're chronically stressed. And trying to get pregnant can be one of those things, right? Also, your ability to your body's ability to ease perimenopause is also going to be challenged. So that when you are chronically stressed, that chronic stress actually exacerbates perimenopause symptoms. That's proven. So it's really important that you're managing your stress. You're not chronically in your fight or flight response. So if you're hustling and pushing and you're perimenopausal, I'm here to tell you, my friend, you're making it worse. And I'm not saying that to be a jerk. But I'm saying it because it's important. There is something you can do, and we're gonna talk about what you can do. Because you're like, "Jen, I just have as much on my plate as there is, and there's nothing I can do. It's just what I have to do." And I get it. I get that you might be feeling really stressed right now. I get that you might have a lot on your plate. I get that you might even be in a state of overwhelm, which we're gonna talk about in a little bit. But staying chronically in your fight or flight response is not actually the most effective way to help you be able to do the things you need to do. Just like that person who asked the question, it was like, "Okay, what if you have a project and you have to get it done? You have this deadline. I don't have time to take a break. I know you're gonna tell me to take a break, but I don't have time to take a break." The answer is that you're actually more productive after you take a break. After you take a break and regulate your nervous system, you're able to get back to that ventral vagal state where all systems are online. Your body no longer thinks it needs to protect you. Then you're gonna actually be able to focus better and be more productive, which is super counterintuitive, and we'll talk more about that. But I wanna talk a little bit more about what can happen if we're chronically in our fight or flight response. If we are chronically pushing, or hustling. And this is some serious stuff because what can happen with those secondary systems not working optimally for an extended period of time is we can end up with major illnesses, some cancers, autoimmune disease. And here's something interesting I read a study that actually, when you are chronically stressed, it dampens your dopamine productivity. And if you're an ADHDer who knows anything about neuroscience, dopamine is, yes, a lot of people are like, "Oh, that's the one for pleasure." Yes, dopamine does help with pleasure. It's a neuromodulator, kinda like a neurotransmitter, but at any rate, it's a chemical in the brain that helps brain cells communicate with each other. And yes, one thing it does is communicate about things that are pleasurable, and it also helps with executive function. It helps you get stuff done, essentially. It helps with focus and prioritizing and follow through and all those goodies. So when we're chronically stressed, we are negatively impacting, we are reducing dopamine productivity, which is a problem for ADHDers because we already have issues with dopamine productivity. And also, if you think about long term, there's a link between Parkinson's and limited dopamine productivity, not necessarily related to ADHD specifically. I think there's some different things going on there between the two. But the study I read was specifically talking about how Parkinson's can be a risk factor when you're talking about chronic stress. And that study was mostly talking about long term adversity, but your nervous system doesn't know the difference between long term adversity, a tiger chasing you, and the stress that you put on yourself. And so these are some big things that can happen that can have a long-term and huge impact. And I will tell you, when those things happen, nothing on that plate is going to get done. It just levels you. And now your focus really is survival when maybe it didn't have to be before. So, another observation before we get into what to do about it, another observation I have is I hear ADHDers talking about they're overwhelmed. They use the word overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed. And if you're familiar with Brene Brown's work, her book, The Atlas of the Heart, which is really it's like the best kind of encyclopedia ever of the 86 emotions that she found in her research that people feel across and express across cultures, right? And the way she did that book is she grouped the emotions with ones that are like it and that you would have in related experiences, but maybe like varying degrees. And in it, she also talked about this in her podcast when she was talking about the book, but she talks about overwhelm, feeling stressed versus feeling overwhelmed. And this is actually an important distinction I want to talk about. And then I want to actually talk about the overwhelm piece because the overwhelm piece will nod us towards what we need to do to get out of this state of chronic stress so that we can be more focused, so that we can prioritize and do things and see them through to completion, so that our executive functioning is as stellar as it can be. but but I want to talk first about the difference between overwhelm and stress. And one of the reasons the words matter is our bodies actually have a neurobiological response to the words of emotions. And you can test this out. You can be like, say the words "I'm stressed" and notice what that feels like. But if you say "I'm overwhelmed," especially when you're stressed, that takes on a whole new level of blah. So the words matter. And the difference between those two words is when you're stressed. And Brene uses a really good example. So I'm going to borrow her example here, crediting her, of course. When she worked in a very busy restaurant down in Houston, when the server was getting stressed, they would go back into the kitchen and say, "I'm in the weeds." That meant that they had a lot going on and they just needed a few extra hands. So they would come in and be like, "Hey, I need waters to table 2, dessert menu to table 6, and can someone greet table 3?" Right? I don't know if that's actually how you talk in a restaurant. The only serving I did was weddings, so we didn't have any of that kind of stuff. We more had people who wanted special meals, even though it was like a catered thing. So anyway, that's always interesting. But I digress. So, yeah, my point is when there is stress, you can still function enough to ask for help, to know what needs to be done, to use your tools and skills. That's, you're in that place, right? So they'd come back, they're like, "I'm in the weeds," and then people would help them as they indicated. But when they would come back and they felt overwhelmed, they would come into the kitchen and say, "I'm blown." And that meant that someone came up to them, took their server tablet, went to the hostess station to double check what tables they had. Because when you're overwhelmed, your brain cannot be trusted that it is accurately assessing what needs to happen, right? You're in your fight or flight response. When you're overwhelmed, you are deep into your fight or flight response and you've been there a while, even if it's just 20 minutes. And so at that point, people took over for them. And the only requirement that person who was overwhelmed had was to leave the restaurant and do nothing for 10 minutes. Complete nothingness. They were allowed to be in the freezer, which to me, I mean, I'm in Minnesota. The only time that sounds appealing is like mid-July, maybe parts of August, beginning of August, definitely not end of August. But in Houston, maybe the freezer sounds like an inviting place. But either way, they were not allowed to be by patrons. They were not allowed to be in the kitchen because the only way to recover from true overwhelm is to do nothing. And so when you are chronically in your fight or flight response or deep into it, the answer is yes, you need to take a break because you're not going to be able to function very well, if at all, until you do. You might think you're getting stuff done, but you are not getting it done near as quickly as you could if you just took the break. We know this is true from how our brains work, but it is so hard for people because it seems counterintuitive. "I've got all this to do. You want me to take a break? That's crazy. That's crazy. I can't take a break." got all this stuff to do. And it's like, yeah, you got all this stuff to do, but you're not going to be productive doing it until you can take a break and get your systems back online so that your prefrontal cortex, the part that does the thinking and planning and organizing and focusing and talking and listening, taking in information, synthesizing information, they're not going to be able to do shit until that is online. And it is not online when you are either in your fight or flight response or your shutdown response. So the answer is to take a break and get some true rest. And in my program, we talk all about nervous system regulation. I actually talk about it in another offer I have, Ignite, which is to help you be able to prioritize, focus, and get stuff done. So if you're interested in that, I can put a link in the show notes for you to look at. But rather than diving deep into nervous system regulation, which is really something I like to do when I'm working with people, what I can say is essentially you need some kind of rest. And there's actually 7 kinds of rest. And I wrote them down because I tend to forget one. So I'm literally going to read these off. But when you are stressed, you need at least one of these kinds of rest when you're chronically in your fight or flight. And quite frankly, in my opinion, which is my professional opinion, 24 plus years of experience in the field of mental health, you need to do these kinds of rest regularly. So, what kind of rest are they? Physical rest, right? Like physically resting your body. You can also, there's active rest, can also be like exercise. That can be a kind of physical rest, especially if it's more moderate, like going for a walk. Mental rest. Some of these are self explanatory, right? Like not doing a thinking task. Emotional rest. Yeah, dialing down that. Sensory rest. That's a big one for us neurodivergent folks. I'll tell you know what? I live alone and I didn't realize it until this most recent time that I lived alone why I always fought having roommates. There was a time when I was really, really struggling financially when I first was out of grad school and divorced. And my friend and her husband, they had money because he inherited his family's business, blah, blah, blah. They're like, you just need a roommate. And I was like, I can't. And I couldn't explain why I couldn't. I was in my late 20s. I still didn't know myself that well. I just knew that I could not handle, maybe I was early 30s by then, but I just knew I could not handle a roommate. I did not know why. But now I understand it's sensory rest. I needed energetic sensory rest. Like I needed no one else's energy or stuff in my space. And I'm not saying all neurodivergent folks, not all ADHDers need to live alone. I'm not saying that at all. But for me, it really helps a lot. At a minimum, I would suggest probably a lot of us need our own space in our homes, but I could be wrong. Some of you might be like, no, I need to be around people all the time. But that could also be because I'm a ambivert. So if you're an extroverted ADHD, or maybe it's totally different. I actually don't know. Sensory rest, social rest, social rest. That's a big one. I was at a women's retreat this past weekend that I helped put on. And then after that, I went to the Cloud Cult concert, which, P.S., if you're not into Cloud Cult yet, I'm not just promoting them because they're a Minnesota band, because of course we like our local Minnesota music. Minnesotans are diehard about Minnesota usually, if we were born and raised here. So there's that. But OMG, best music ever. Super self-helpy, spiritual, philosophical lyrics. Just really cool. And the lead, Craig, just seems like just a really grounded spiritual dude who is working through stuff and opening the floor for others to work through stuff. So anyway, but I went to their concert, which was great, but very people-y. And on Sunday, I was like, no more people. No people today. I have no energy for people. And I might have texted with a couple of friends, but it was a very very low people day for me because I needed some social rest, right? Creative rest. Sometimes doing things creative that are creative can be another way that we get rest because it feeds our soul. Spiritual rest. Sometimes we need to connect with something bigger than ourselves. And for some, that can be being out in nature. In fact, being out in nature will help most of us if we're in a state of overwhelm or chronically stressed. In fact, getting out in nature every single day, I highly recommend, especially trying to be with it and notice it, not just be on your phone when you're out there. That sounded really negative and judgy. Sorry about that. But I think some of that judgment is towards myself, right? Like we all do it. But it is super ineffective when we could look at the trees and the flowers and the grass and the animals and maybe in the winter, the snow, the sun, the sky, whatever. So those are the 7 types of rest. And so when we talk about how do we get regulated? How do we increase our ability to focus? A big piece of it is not hustling, not pushing and pushing, but actually taking the break because I'm here to tell you, you are going to get so much more done when your nervous system is regulated. And you're going to be more effective. I can get a lot done when I'm dysregulated and pushing. But I make a lot more mistakes, and I go back later and I go, "Oh, I could have done this better because here's this deeper thought that I had after when I slowed down." Have you ever noticed that? Yeah, whereas if we slow down, let things simmer, let it go into our deeper awareness, into our inner wise woman, then we actually are not only more productive, but the things that we share with people, the ways we help people is richer in a way that it can't be when it comes from our hustling, when it comes from our pushing, when it essentially comes from our stress response, essentially survival. So I hope this is helpful for you and more than answers the question of what do I do when I have so much on my plate that I can't take a break? Take a break because it will actually help you be more productive. So, all right, y'all. If you're not following yet, I would love it if you follow. And if you found this meaningful and you know someone with ADHD, even if they're not an entrepreneur, even if they're not a woman that might find this helpful, I would love it if you would share. That would make my heart sing. I would really appreciate it. This Minnesota gal over here would just be super pumped about that. So, anyway, I would love to have you share this with people, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.